Alright, so welcome to this lesson where we're going to take a look at animating our CSS 3D cube. And we're going to animate it in one or two ways, and I'm going to show you the pros and cons of each way. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open our file up right here, which is css3dcube.html that we created in the last lesson. And so what I want to do now is to start rotating this around and doing some really cool animations. So I'm just going to scroll down, and right here what I want to do is first of all set up a timeline. So what is that? Well, I'm going to illustrate this with Flash right here. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is draw out a cube, and basically right here we have our timeline, and our timeline consists of frames. Think of frames as like pages in a flicker book. Each time a page is flicked, something moves slightly, that creates the animation. But what are keyframes? Well, keyframes allow us to program certain points within the timeline, and then obviously interpretation can be done between the 2 points. And of course CSS does that automatically. But to illustrate this, we have the keyframe, which is keyframe 1. You can tell by that little circle right there. And then I'm going to go out to frame 50 and I'm going to insert a keyframe, not just a regular frame. So all these frames right here that don't have circles, they're just regular frames, but these ones with circles are keyframes. So I'm going to go to frame 50, and that keyframe right there, I'm just going to move that cube across. So once I've gone ahead and done that, I'm just going to right click in between there, and I'm going to say create a shape tween. And what that's going to do is actually create an animation, as you can see. So I only actually created 2 keyframes, and then I said, you know what, you now interpret between those points. And that's exactly how CSS animations work. You program your keyframes, and then CSS takes over and basically does the interpolation between the 2 points. So this is really cool. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is first of all create a blank timeline, so it's going to have nothing on it. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is use the @ symbol, and because I'm going to be using this in a WebKit based browser, I'm just going to put in the WebKit prefix like so, and then I'm going to say keyframes, and you'll notice it changes to a nice dark red color, so that tells me that I've typed it correctly, which is good. And then I need to give my animation a name, so I can point to that animation and apply it onto a DOM element. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just call this rotate. Nice and easy. And then I want to open and close my parentheses right here. Now inside of those 2 parentheses you are going to program your keyframes. So we're going to start out with the simplest animation, which is just basically 2 keyframes. So what I'm going to do is say from. So this is the start of the animation, so I'm going to go from something to something else. So from is basically the very first keyframe. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is just affect the background color for now. So I'm just going to say background, and then I'm just going to set that color right there to something like a red. That'll do. And then I want to sort of go to sort of a blue color. So I'm just going to say 2. And again, I'm going to put my parentheses in here, and this is where all of my CSS properties go. So again, you don't just have to affect the background, you could affect several other things as well, such as margin, height, width, and so on and so forth. But in this case, I'm just changing the background color, and it will transition between those colors. So I'm just going to say color, and let's go ahead and make this sort of like a blue sort of color. That's looking pretty good. Alright, so once I've gone ahead and done that, this by itself will do absolutely nothing. Why? Because it's not focusing on a specific element. So we need to apply this animation to an element. So what I'm going to do is point to the element, and in this case what I'm going to do is point to the front face, since that's the face that's automatically facing towards us when we load the page. And then what I want to do is apply that animation. So again, I'm going to put the WebKit prefix in here because we're working with the WebKit based browser, but you also need to put in the Moz prefix and also the non-prefix version of the animation property. And once you do that, the first thing you need to define is what animation exactly do you want to apply to this DOM element. And so we've called this animation rotate, so that's exactly what we're going to put right here, rotate. And again, this is case sensitive, so if I have a capital R right here, this also needs to be a capital R. And so once I've done that, the next thing that I need to define is how long is this animation going to take place. So this isn't like Flash, where I've got keyframe 1 and keyframe 50 and I can sort of set the frames per second and that's sort of the timing. I'm actually setting the timing right here in seconds, so I could say 1 second or 2 seconds. So this allows my animation to be very, very flexible. I can set all of the keyframes, but I don't have to keep moving the keyframes around. I can just set the time. And of course, these keyframes are working on percentages. So this is 0% of the animation, and this is the end of the animation. So I'm just going to say 2 seconds, or perhaps even longer. Let's go ahead and say 3 seconds. And you can also use decimal places. So you can say 3.5, which is 3,500 milliseconds, like so. And so what I'm going to do is just say 3 seconds, and then also we can define how many times we want it to loop. Do we want it to basically just loop once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, or we can have it loop an infinite amount of times. So how do we do that? Well, we just have to say infinite, and that will loop it an infinite amount of times. So if I go ahead and save that, and let's preview that in Safari and hit refresh, you'll notice it's taking 3 seconds to go from red to blue, and then it snaps back again to frame 1 and then starts transitioning through and through and through. If we didn't have infinite on there, so if I just took that away, what would happen is you would get this. So hit refresh, we go to blue, and then it snaps back and it doesn't play anymore. It only plays once. And also I can run this through twice. So right here you'll see it will go to blue, then it will snap back to frame 1 again and play through again, and then it will stop. So that's pretty cool. So the next thing that I want to sort of take a look at is how to add more keyframes. How do we actually get more control into our animation? Well, let's just change this back to infinite. And what I want to do here is, obviously this is 0% and this is 100%, so I can basically have any percentage in between 0 and 100. So if I said 20%, like so, and then say background yellow, and then I could add in another keyframe, let's say 70%, and I'll make this green, like so, and just go ahead and save that, go back, hit refresh, and there you go. So you can add a lot of keyframes in here to control your animation. So the next thing that I want to look at is actually changing this from and to, because let's say I don't want to start from 0%. Perhaps maybe I want to wait until 20% and then start to do the animation. We can go ahead and do that, take away the from, save that, go back, hit refresh, and there we go. So we're starting at 20%. Also, you don't have to say from, you could say 0% and 100%, just like so. And again, that'll work exactly the same. So as you can see, animations are incredibly flexible inside of CSS, and they give you great control. And this is one of the advantages of using this type of way of animating in CSS, because you do get immense control over your animation. But it's not necessarily the best way, and I'll explain later on. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is now rotate my cube on the y-axis. So what I'm going to do is basically put in here the WebKit prefix version of the transform CSS property. Again, you should provide the Moz prefix and the non-prefix version. So I'm just going to say WebKit transform, and then I'm just going to say rotate on the y-axis 0 degrees, which, as you know, is completely pointless. But however, what I'm going to do is copy that, and then I'm just going to paste it below. And then what I want to do is possibly make this 30 degrees, and then paste this below, and then we're going to make this 210 degrees, so going a little bit crazy right there, and then paste this in, and we'll set this to 360 degrees. So if I go ahead and save that, and let's go ahead and preview this in the browser. So here you'll be able to see that we're getting this animation, but don't forget this is on the front, this is not on the actual cube itself, which was my fault right here. So I'm just going to change that to cube. So we're rotating all of the faces in unison. And there we go, we're rotating our cube, and that looks awesome. And again, you don't have to go with just rotating on the y-axis. You could go ahead and rotate on the x-axis and so forth and so on. So I could say rotate x 50 degrees, something like that. And you can just go absolutely crazy with this stuff. So rotate z 120 deg or degrees. Go back, hit refresh, and you're just going to get a totally weird animation sort of thing. But that looks pretty cool actually. So there you go, you can create all sorts of really cool animations with this. You can also control the animation as well. So for example, in this case we won't need to use JavaScript. Now if you have a child element and you want to affect its parent, you're going to have to use JavaScript. However, if it's on the same level or on a greater level, then you can just use CSS to help control this. So for example, let's go ahead and take a look at adding in an anchor, and I'm adding this as a child element of the body, and I'm just going to make this a dummy link, and we'll just say animate right there. So once I've gone ahead and done that, the next thing I'm going to do is give this an ID of anim. And so what I'm going to say is ultimately you're going to have to point to the cube because that's what you're applying the animation to. But what we want to do is put in a few conditions for that selector to actually be true. So I'm going to point to the anim first of all. And then what I'm going to do is say hover. So only when the user hovers over this, or you could say, you know, active, so if they click it, but that can sort of cause a bit of a problem when you do that. So hover's the better option right here. And then I'm going to say immediately after, so this is the plus, immediately after we have the viewport. So we have the anchor, immediately after the viewport, and then after that we have the cube. Now the cube is actually the child, as you know, of the viewport. So what we want to do is put in this symbol right here where the viewport right here is the parent of the child with the ID of cube, and then we're applying that animation to that element right there, to the cube. So basically we're just applying some preambles, if you will. So I'm going to hit refresh. You'll notice it's not animating, but when I hover over this now, then it starts to actually animate. But you'll notice when I hover off, it snaps. So this is something that's not really great about animations inside of CSS, well, using the keyframes and the timeline, because it snaps. So we don't want that. We like a nice smooth transition. So unfortunately, the keyframe animation in CSS is not really going to cut it for us. But however, very quickly, with the animation CSS property, you need to put on the mos prefix and also the non-prefix version to get maximum compatibility. So what I'm going to go ahead and do now is basically comment that out. And the next thing I want to do is take a look at the cube selector. And what I want to do is apply the transition CSS property. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the WebKit version, transition. And what this is basically going to allow us to do is transition between CSS properties. So for example, if we change the background color, if we change the width, the height, the margin, the padding, and so forth and so on, and any animatable CSS properties, it's going to transition from one to the other. And with this CSS property, we can tell it to do that, and also what we can do is define the time in which it takes to go from one point to the other. So this is obviously a lot more limited than doing the animation. However, it's much nicer because it has no snapping, it's very fluent, and also it's less processor intensive, especially when it comes to mobile devices, and I'll explain that in just a second. So the first thing we can define is the CSS properties that we want to actually animate. And in this case, I'm going to say all. So all basically means all the CSS properties that can be transitioned is going to be transitioned. So the width, the height, the padding. But in our case, it's going to be the transform CSS property that's going to be animated. And then I can define the time in which the transition is going to interpret from one point to the other. So I could say again 1 second or 1s right there. Again, you could go into your decimals by saying 0.5, so 1.5 seconds. I'm just going to make this 2 seconds. And then I'm going to copy that CSS property right there and put the mos prefix on and also the non-prefix version for maximum compatibility. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that. And then I'm going to scroll down, and where we have this selector right here, which is targeting our anchor right here, but however, it's ultimately targeting the cube, in which we are then going to change the CSS properties, and then it's automatically going to interpret the change and make that animation. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to take a look at changing the transform CSS property. So I'm going to say WebKit transform, and that will allow me to apply some transform functions. So for example, I could say rotate on the x-axis by -90 degrees, and then I can also apply some rotation again on the y-axis perhaps by 50 degrees, and then finally what we'll do is rotate on the z-axis. And don't forget, you can do translate as well. So in fact what I'll do is a translate transform function inside of here. So we'll say rotate z 130 degrees. Let's just increase these values right here because they're a little bit small, so we won't really get a impact of an animation. And then I'm just going to say translate on the x-axis by 400 pixels. So we have all of these transform functions, and if I go ahead and save that now and we go back and hit refresh, when we hover over this, you'll notice that it's basically moving, it's rotating, and so forth. That is really, really cool. And don't forget, the reason why it's actually moving closer to us is because we have rotated this first rather than asking it to move first. So don't forget, the axes are local to the object. So perhaps maybe you don't want that kind of effect, you want this sort of effect where it stays sort of in the same distance away from the viewer, but however it's rotating and also moving as well. So that's really, really cool. And as you can see, there's no snapping. When I hover over this, it starts to play the animation. If I hover off, then it goes back to the default. And that's it. That's how easy it is. And the reason why this is actually better, not in terms of animation control, because you don't have that much control. You basically say, right, you're going to go from this point to this point. That's basically what transition is. So you can't have loads and loads of different points that are interpreting in between. However, when you use the animation down here, the problem is it has to redraw every frame, and this actually causes a major problem on mobile devices. It's not as quick and as snappy. Whereas if we just set the transition and then also set the CSS properties right there, it'll automatically interpret between those points and also the time that you've set it, and it will do it automatically. There's no snapping. And also, it doesn't have to redraw the frame, so it's not so processor intensive, especially when it comes to mobile devices. That's the main point that I'm trying to make here, is the mobile devices are not as powerful as obviously my laptop. And we're not just talking about iPads, because they're actually fairly powerful. We're talking about even lesser devices such as the iPhone 3GS. As I said, don't go for the latest technology, go for the older technology, because that will mean that it'll actually run a lot better on the newer stuff as well as the old stuff as well. So that's really cool. Now, the final thing that I just want to add in right here is the support number 1 for this transform CSS property. So we need to put in the mos prefix and also the non-prefix version to get maximum support. And with the keyframe animation, what we should do is basically just copy that, but what we don't want is the WebKit prefix, like so. So we just have the normal keyframe timeline, and that's it. Basically, you will have maximum browser support by doing that and adding in those prefixes and so forth, and it's as easy as that. It's very simple, and I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. I hope you play around with those animations and also test them on iOS devices as well, which is really cool. So in the next lesson, we're actually going to take a look at a dialog box that actually uses 3D transitions as well as 2D transitions as well to make some really cool and intuitive effects for a model dialog box. And we're also going to take a look in that chapter Oridomi, which allows you to create folding paper effects, and Impress.js, which allows you to create presentations effectively by using DOM attributes, which is really cool and very simple to use. So this is really amazing, great technology. Have a play around with it and see what you can come up with. So thanks for watching this lesson, and I hope you can join me in the next one.